अब ये थोड़ा बहुत ही कॉम्प्लेक्स था. यूरोसेंट्रिसिज्म इज बोथ target and the motive force of post-colonial political theory. Now, if we read Paul Science syllabus formally, then we do not have post-colonial theory per se as part of the syllabus, but we have something of the post-colonial theory. Chapter number 2, post-colonial theory of state. वहाँ पे formally explicitly mention किया है, तो वो तो एक है उसमें. And then while reading on feminism, so we look at feminism in terms of waves, first wave, second wave, third wave, fourth wave. So third, fourth wave में post colonial feminism है. Okay, उसमें Spivaks है, then Hooks है, बाकी सब नाम है उसमें. Okay, तो even if you know about those two components which are part of the post colonial theory, you would definitely would have been in a better place to answer this. लेकिन क्वेश्चन में क्या है? यूरोसेंट्रिसिज्म इज बोथ टारगेट एंड मोटिव फोर्स बिहाइंड ऑफ द पोस्ट colonial political theory. There are two important elements of the question. Let us simplify that. Question per se is on post colonial theory. Am I right? A. 2. But what of post colonial theory is asked? Post colonial theory is asked in spatial reference with, as if the motives. So एक motive है to target the Eurocentricism, यानी कि to criticize them, and the other motive is something very different. अब वो motive क्या है? Inspiration बोला है ना उसको. Okay, target motive force बोला है उसको. Inspirational force या motive force बोला है. Motive force का मतलब क्या है? What is mean by that? Motive force. Something which motivates you to, yes, वो reason ही है ना. यानी कि rational क्या है? किस चीज की वजह से, किस reason, किस rational से what post colonial theory सामने आती है, propose की गई है. Okay. अब just look into this. ये क्वेश्चन में दिया था, इसलिए मैंने I have briefly explained what is Eurocentrism. Eurocentrism has been variously defined as an attitude, conceptual apparatus, or set of empirical beliefs that frame Europe as the primary engine and architect of the world history, the bearer of universal values and reason, and the pinnacle and therefore model of progress and development. ये थोड़ा बड़ा sentence है, even if you make it simple, which seeks to project Europe as what? Model of progress and development. अगर आपको progress करना है, develop करना है, then look at Europe, because that is seen as the pinnacle of everything. Okay, role model. So Eurocentrism में वही है. Okay, in Eurocentric narratives, the superiority of Europe, अब ये थोड़ा simpler version है, of Europe is evident in its achievements in economic and political systems, technologies, and the high quality of life enjoyed by its society. Eurocentrism is more than banal ethnocentric prejudice, however, as it is intimately tied to and indeed constituted in violence and asymmetry of colonial and imperial encounters. Eurocentrism is what makes this violence not only possible, but also acceptable or justiciable. We are well aware of one theory which was used by colonialism to justify colonial regime. Which is that theory? हाँ, ये थोड़ा कॉम्प्लेक्स लगा होगा आपको, तो वो उसका रेफरेंस पॉइंट है. अब ये खाली बनाल नहीं है, तो इट इज अ वेरी कॉन्शियसली रची हुई साजिश है वो. तो इसीलिए तो वो सेंटेंस देखिए ना क्या है, कॉन्स्टिट्यूटेड इन द वायलेंस एंड एसिमेट्री ऑफ कॉलोनियल एंड इंपीरियल एनकाउंटर्स. क्योंकि colonies, that is society like ours, did not possess the kind of power which was possessed by the colonizers. Okay, and they employed the means of violence. Okay, and that is how we can take note of the asymmetry of power possessed by them as well as the subject population like ours. Therefore, it is what makes this violence not only possible but also acceptable and justiciable. So these are the aspects of Eurocentrism. Now, post-colonial theory, we have come up with one short para is a more recent subfield of political theory, yes, although its parameters and particular meanings are less than clearly defined and subject to contestation. ये है वैसा, क्योंकि we cannot define it in a one uniform, coherent way because there are a lot of traditions within the school. Okay, the post-colonial political theory is broadly a body of thought. अब ये important है, concerned with tracing, engaging and responding to the cultural, political, social and economic legacies of the Western colonialism. अब modern political thought में क्या पढ़ते हैं हम? What do we study in modern political thought? Modern Indian political thought. Modern Indian political thought. अब अगर पहले जो है पहले जो थिंकर है उसमें कौन है पहले? सर सैयद अहमद खां. सैयद अहमद खां इज लाइक अ मॉडरेट नेशनलिस्ट. ओके, लेकिन बाकी के देखिए अरविंदो क्वाइट क्रिटिकल ऑफ मॉडरेट्स ऑन वन हैंड and the colonial regime on the other hand. Then comes Dr. Ambedkar. Okay, quite critical of Indian national movement, there is no doubt about that. And he seeks to utilize every possible means which was available in the colonial regime to convince the colonial regime to grant certain concessions to the community. Okay, no doubt about that. Then comes Gandhi, obviously critical of the colonial regime. And then M.N. Roy, being a Marxist, critical of colonialism on one hand and even critical of Indian national movement and Indian society on the other hand. Ab you look at the way in which every modern Indian political thinker engages with what? The legacies of the, not legacy per se, but they were very much part of the colonial regime. अब ये legacy किसके लिए बनता है? It becomes, that is colonialism, becomes a legacy for the scholars who later on try to make sense of ये सब कुछ है, ये ऐसा कैसे हुआ वो. ओके, तो मैंने थिंकर का नाम इसलिए दिया है क्योंकि हम थिंकर पढ़ते ही है. तो थिंकर में देर आर नाउ अरविंदो इज अ रिप्रेजेंटेटिव एग्जांपल ऑफ दैट. सो ही एंगेजेस विथ colonialism in a very very critical way. Similarly गांधी डज दैट. ओके, रॉय भी करते हैं लेकिन उनका कॉन्टेक्स्ट अलग है. लेकिन गांधी और अरविंदो आप जब देखोगे तो वी कैन डेफिनेटली से दैट बोथ ऑफ देम टेक्स समथिंग फ्रॉम, बोथ ऑफ देम टेक्स समथिंग वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट फ्रॉम इंडियन पास्ट, इंडियन legacy, and try to refute the white man's burden theory which was used by colonialism. And there is a question on that. Relevance of Arvindo's concept of Swaraj. उसमें है वो हम बाद में देखेंगे उसको. Okay, so let us look into that. Particularly the period of European colonialism. So post-colonial theory का peculiarity क्या है? Tracing, engaging, responding to the cultural, political, social and economic legacies of the Western colonialism. उसका simple सा मतलब ये है, even though we have become independent in 47, have we completely cut off ourselves from or freed ourselves from the clutches of or the legacy of colonialism? नहीं है ना. इसीलिए यूपीएससी ने उसके पहले ऐसे पूछा था colonialism पे ऐसे. आप you just try to find it out what was the exact topic of that. Okay, decolonizing one's own minds. बहुत सारे सवाल उस पे जीएस में, हिस्ट्री में भी पूछे गए थे और ऐसे भी उसके ऊपर पूछा गया था. ओके, सो एंगेजिंग विद दैट, द लीगेसी ऑफ दैट. देयरफॉर सिंस पोस्ट colonial condition has emerged from the European colonial encounter, Eurocentrism becomes a target of post colonial political theory. अब गांधी का हिंद स्वराज क्या है? क्या करते हैं उसमें वो? टारगेट्स क्रिटिसाइज वेस्टर्न सिविलाइजेशन. ओके, सिमिलरली अरविंदो, अब ये लीडर्स में बता रहा हूं, उसके बाद स्कॉलर्स है. ओके, सो टारगेट ये है. एडिशनली, सिंस द फोरमोस्ट ऑब्जेक्टिव ऑफ पोस्ट colonial political theory is to understand the European sources of power. What is the other motive? Objective of post colonial theory is to understand the European sources of power. वो भी समझना है ना हमें, किया कैसे उन्होंने, how could they rule us for such a long time? Okay, that shape the post colonial condition and find ways to subvert through old and new forms of indigenous and subaltern knowledge. Eurocentrism also becomes the motive force for post-colonial political theory. वो टारगेट भी है, टारगेट है का मतलब we criticize them. That is a post-colonial theory makes it a point to criticize Eurocentrism. लेकिन मोटिव फोर्स किस अर्थ से है वो? It is motive force in the sense, read it once again. Foremost objective of post-colonial political theory is to understand the European sources of power that shape the post-colonial condition and find ways to subvert it through old and new forms of indigenous and other legacies of knowledge. Aim क्या है post-colonial theory का? If we ask this simple सवाल, what is the objective of post-colonial theory? Objective, end result क्या है? Sorry, aim क्या है उनका? तो simple से कह सकते हैं ना हम, to annihilate every exploitative legacy of colonialism. Can we say this? Okay. तो वो जो डोमिनेंस था, वो कोर्शन था, वो हेजिमनी थी, सबको हमें खत्म करना है. We can broadly say this, but how can we do that? इसके लिए क्या समझना पड़ेगा? अंडरस्टैंड द यूरोपियन सोर्सेस ऑफ पावर. इसीलिए वो मोटिव फोर्स बन जाता है कि what forms of power were evolved by them, what instrumentalities of power were generated by them, and in what way those forms and instrumentality of power were what? Employed by them. आपने किया कैसे? तो उसको भी हमें समझना पड़ेगा. And then subvert भी बोला है, find ways to subvert it through old and new forms of indigenous and subaltern knowledge. अब ये थियरी हमें सिलेबस में नहीं है, इसीलिए मैंने ये दिया है, उसमें 2 पैराग्राफ्स बड़े उस पे ही दिए हैं. अब ये उसमें मैंने 2 एग्जांपल्स दिए हैं विच आर डेफिनेटली फ्रॉम आवर सिलेबस. एक है पोस्ट कॉलोनियल थियरी ऑफ स्टेट का है, वो तो सिलेबस का हिस्सा है. सो पोस्ट कॉलोनियल थियरी ऑफ स्टेट डज बोथ टारगेट यूरोसेंट्रिज्म, criticizes, and on the other hand what tries to understand as to what forms of power, instrumentality of power are used by Eurocentric perspective. और दूसरा जो एग्जाम्पल मैंने दिया है नीचे है, ये वो थोड़ा मैंने बड़ा किया है, पोस्ट कॉलोनियल फेमिनिस्ट थियरी. हुक्स एंड स्पिवाक refer to women of color feminism challenge the imperialist and patriarchal frames of second wave feminism for being too white, too straight, thus ignoring the differences in culture, living conditions and experiences of women of color or women from post-colonial societies. अब इतना भी आपको अच्छे से पता है ना, you would have definitely answered the question. तो थोड़ा फ्री माइंड से, फ्रीलांस तरीके से आपको पढ़ना भी चाहिए. If you do that, you would be better placed to deal even these kinds of questions. Okay.